The fluorescent lights of Morgan's corner store buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the cluttered aisles stacked with canned goods and cheap snacks. It was late afternoon, the kind of slow hour where the hum of the cooler was louder than the chatter, when Chris Baldwin shuffled through the door. At 58, he looked like the road had chewed him up and spit him out, his coat patched at the elbows, his beard a tangled mess, his hands clutching a frayed plastic bag that rattled with a few loose cans. He kept his head low, moving toward the bread aisle, but the second he stepped in, Linda Morgan's voice cut through the quiet like a whip. "Hey, you!" She barked from behind the counter, her arms crossed over her starched uniform. Chris paused, his shoulders hunching as he turned. Linda, mid-30s and sharp as a tack, sized him up with a sneer that could peel paint. "We don't serve your kind here," she said, loud enough for the handful of customers, a mom with a kid, an old guy flipping through a magazine, to look up. "Out now!" Chris met her glare, his gray eyes steady behind the grime, but he didn't argue. He nodded once, slow and quiet, and shuffled back toward the door, the bell jingling as he stepped into the dusk. The mom frowned, the old guy muttered something under his breath, but Linda just smirked, brushing her hands like she'd swatted a fly. Chris wasn't new to this. Kicked out of places, stared at like he was less than human. 5 years ago, he'd had a life, a small hardware business, a house, a wife who'd light up a room. Then cancer took her, the bills piled up, and the bank snatched everything else. Now he was just another shadow on Fairview streets, scraping by on odd jobs and kindness that didn't come often. But he'd kept his head up, his heart stubborn, even when folks like Linda looked through him. Tonight, though, something was different. As he trudged down the sidewalk, his bag swinging against his leg, a beat-up sedan pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and Mr. Hughes, his old friend's lawyer, gray suit and all, leaned out. "Chris," he said, his voice low, "it's time." Inside the car, the air smelled of leather and paperwork. Hughes handed him a folder, thick with legal jargon and numbers that made Chris's head spin. "Tom left you something," Hughes said, tapping the pages. "Died last month. Cancer, like your Ellen. Put you in his will. Enough to get you back on your feet." Chris stared at the figure. 6 digits, a lifeline he hadn't dared dream of. Tom, his college buddy turned investor, had always said he'd repay the favor from their startup days. Now he had, from beyond the grave. Chris's hands shook as he closed the folder, his voice rough. "This real?" Hughes nodded, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Real as it gets. What are you going to do with it?" Chris didn't answer right away. He leaned back, the streetlights flickering past, Linda's sneer flashing in his mind. "We don't serve your kind." He'd been a businessman once, knew how to turn $1 into 10, how to build something from scratch. The money wasn't just a roof or a meal. It was a chance, a shot at something bigger. "Hughes," he said finally, his voice steadying, "find me a store. Something local. Something I can fix." Hughes raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "Got one in mind," he said, pulling out his phone. "Corner place on 5th, Morgan's. Been on the market a week. Owner's retiring." "You sure?" Chris's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "Yeah, I'm sure." By midnight, the deal was in motion. Cash wired, papers drawn up, Hughes working his magic to keep it quiet. Chris sat in a cheap motel room, the folder open on the bed, his old life and this new chance staring back at him. He'd lost everything once, let the world grind him down, but not this time. Linda's voice echoed, "Out now," and he pictured that store, her smug face behind the counter. He wasn't just buying a building. He was buying a reckoning, a way to turn the tables on every sneer, every shove out the door. What would she say when he walked back in? Not as a bum, but as the man who owned it all. And why'd he let her chase him off so easy tonight, knowing what was coming? The sun was barely up when Chris Baldwin stood across the street from Morgan's corner store, his breath fogging in the early chill. At 58, he looked every bit the part of the man Linda Morgan had kicked out the day before. His coat still patched, his boots scuffed, his beard a wild tangle. But his gray eyes burned with something new, a quiet fire stoked by the folder tucked under his arm and the deal that had gone through overnight. He watched the store's lights flicker on, the open signs swinging in the window, and pictured Linda behind that counter, smirking like she owned the world. Not for long. he thought, his lips twitching into a faint, hard line. He didn't go in, not yet. He leaned against a lamppost, blending into the morning shadows, and let the place unfold. Customers trickled through, delivery guy with a clipboard, an old lady with a cane, a kid counting change for soda. Linda's voice carried out the open door, sharp and loud as ever. "Move it, Granny. Don't hold up my line," she snapped at the old lady, who flinched and fumbled her coins. The kid got it next. "What, you think this is a charity? Pay up or get lost." Chris's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the folder. He'd seen her type before, back when he ran his hardware gig. Managers like her bled good people dry, chased off customers for a quick ego boost. She hadn't changed overnight, but everything else was about to. Inside a diner 2 blocks down, Chris met Mr. Hughes over coffee that tasted like burnt tires. The lawyer slid a thick envelope across the table, his suit crisp despite the hour. "It's done," Hughes said, tapping the papers. "Morgan's Corner Store. Yours as of 3 a.m. Seller signed off. Cash cleared. Titles in your name. Quiet as a mouse, like you wanted." Chris opened the envelope, scanning the deed, his name in bold, the address staring back like a promise kept. "No leaks?" he asked, his voice low. Hughes shook his head. "Not a peep. Staff won't know till you walk in." "You sure about this, Chris? Could have bought a condo, a car, hell, a vacation. Why a rundown store?" Chris sipped the coffee, wincing at the taste, and set the mug down. "Lost my old life sitting still," he said, his tone rough but steady. "This ain't about money. It's about showing him. People like her, they don't get to win." Hughes leaned back, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Tom, be proud," he said, then slid a set of keys across. "Your store, your rules. What's the plan?" Chris pocketed the keys, his fingers brushing the cold metal. "Walking tomorrow," he said. "Let him see." Hughes nodded, a grin tugging at his mouth. "Gonna be one hell of a show." Back outside, Chris lingered near the store again, keeping his distance as the day wore on. Linda was in rare form, snapping at a guy in a frayed jacket who dared ask for a discount, tossing a half-eaten apple at a stray cat that wandered too close. "Scram, you little pest," she yelled, laughing as it bolted. The other employees, 2 teens and a middle-aged cashier, kept their heads down, their movements quick, like they'd learned to dodge her temper. Chris watched it all, his stomach twisting. He'd been on the streets long enough to know that look, the way people shrink when they're scared, ashamed, beaten down. He'd felt it himself, yesterday, when she'd chased him out. Now he had the power to flip it, and he wasn't letting it slip. By nightfall, word was creeping through the store's back channels. The teens whispered over a mop bucket. Heard the owner sold out, some big shop bought it. The cashier shrugged, ringing up a late customer. "Hope they're nicer than Linda. Woman's a damn tornado." Linda caught the tail end, storming over with her hands on her hips. "What's this about a new owner?" she barked, her voice shrill. The cashier stammered, "Just talk, ma'am. Nothing solid." Linda snorted, brushing it off. "Better not be some bleeding heart. Place'll go broke in a week." She strutted back to the counter, oblivious, her world still hers for one more night. Chris, tucked in an alley across the street, caught the chatter through the open window, his pulse quickening. They didn't know. None of them did. He spent the night in that same motel room, the deed spread out on the bed. A cheap suit Hughes had scrounged up hanging in the closet. He didn't sleep much, just stared at the ceiling, Linda's voice looping in his head. "We don't serve your kind." 5 years of losing, his business, his home, his wife, had stripped him bare, but this wasn't about revenge. It was about proving something to her, to the world, to himself. He'd walked away yesterday, head down, but tomorrow he'd walk back in, head high. The keys sat heavy in his pocket, the weight of a second chance. He'd been a nobody to them, a ghost they could kick around, but ghosts could come back, stronger, sharper, ready to haunt. Morning loomed, and Chris stood, running a hand through his beard, picturing Linda's face when the truth hit. The store was his now. Every shelf, every register, every inch she'd ruled like a petty queen. When would she figure it out? When he stepped through the door? Or when the papers hit her hands? And what would she do when the rug got yanked out from under her? leaving her staring up at the man she'd laughed out of her kingdom. Hey, if you're guessing how Linda's going to take this, Chris might have said if he were here with you. Drop your thoughts below. Like this if you're rooting for Chris, and hit subscribe. We're building to something big. The bell above Morgan's corner store jingled sharp and clear as Chris Baldwin stepped inside, the morning sun glinting off the glass behind him. At 58, he didn't look like the same man Linda Morgan had kicked out 2 days ago. Not in the clean lines of a thrift store suit, his beard trimmed just enough to show the steel in his jaw. The folder with the deed was tucked under his arm, his keys jangling in his pocket, but his gray eyes carried the weight of everything he'd been through. 5 years on the streets, a lifetime of loss, and now this, a second shot he'd never seen coming. The store hummed with its usual rhythm, customers browsing, the teens stocking shelves, the cashier counting change. But it all screeched to a halt when Linda's voice sliced through. You again? She snapped, storming out from behind the counter, her arms crossed tight over her uniform. Her sneer was the same, that curl of her lip that had chased him out before, and she didn't hesitate. Thought I told you to stay gone. Don't need your stinkin' here. The old lady from yesterday paused mid-aisle, her cane tapping the floor, and the kid with the soda turned, wide-eyed. Chris didn't flinch, just stood there, his boots planted firm, letting her words hang. The air thickened, head swiveling, and Linda took it as her cue to double down. What, you deaf now? Out before I call the cops. She jabbed a finger toward the door, her voice loud enough to rattle the cans on the shelf. Chris tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Not smug, just steady, like a man who'd already won. Might want to hold off on that, he said, his voice low but cutting through her rant. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the folder, and flipped it open with a flick of his wrist. The deed slid across the counter, the bold print of Christopher Baldwin, owner staring up at her like a slap. Linda's finger froze mid-air, her smirk twitching, then fading as her eyes darted over the paper. What the hell is this? She muttered, snatching it up, her hands trembling as she scanned the lines, sale date, signatures, the notary stamp. Real. Too damn real. The store went dead quiet, the kind of hush where you could hear a pin drop, or the old lady's gasp as she leaned closer. The teens stopped stacking, their jaws slack, and the cashier peeked over Linda's shoulder, her eyes popping wide. No way, she whispered, but Linda didn't hear, her face draining to a sickly gray. Chris stepped forward, his voice calm, but iron hard. Yesterday, you kicked a customer out, he said, locking eyes with her. Today, I'm your boss. The words landed like a hammer, each one sinking deeper, and Linda's knees wobbled, her hands clutching the counter to keep from folding. You can't, she stammered, but the deed in her grip said otherwise. The room erupted, not in noise, but in a wave of stunned stares and choked breaths. The kid dropped his soda, began rolling across the floor with a fizz. The old lady clutched her cane, a grin breaking through her wrinkles. Well, I'll be damned, she muttered, loud enough for the teens to snort. Linda's head snapped up, her eyes wild, darting from Chris to the paper to the faces gawking at her. This is a joke, right? She said, her voice shrill, cracking at the edges. You are homeless. You're nothing. Chris didn't blink, just leaned in, his tone soft but sharp enough to cut. Wasn't nothing when I signed that last night. Check the date. She did, her fingers shaking as she traced the ink. March 27th, 2025. Yesterday, 24 hours ago, she'd owned this moment, this store, this little kingdom where she could shove people like Chris out the door. Now it was his, and the weight of it crushed her smug little world to dust. The cashier stepped back, her hands up like she didn't want any part of this, while the teens whispered fast. That's him? The new owner? No freaking way. Chris let it sink in, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the shock, the awe, the flicker of fear in Linda's eyes. He'd been a ghost to them, a nobody they could kick around but ghosts could haunt, and he was here now, solid, real, in charge. Linda's mouth worked, no sound coming out at first, then a weak, I didn't know, I didn't mean. Chris held up a hand, cutting her off mid-stammer. You meant it, he said, his voice steady, carrying years of grit. Every word, every shove. Thought I was trash, huh? Well, trash just bought your store. The old lady clapped a sharp, delighted sound, and the kid nodded like he'd just seen a superhero unmask. Linda shrank, her shoulders hunching, the fight draining out of her as the reality hit. She wasn't just wrong, she was done. Chris folded his arms, the deed back in his grip, and stood tall, a man who'd clawed his way back from nothing to everything. The store buzzed now, whispers turning to murmurs, the air electric with what had just gone down. Linda stared at him, her kingdom crumbling, her power gone in a heartbeat. Chris didn't gloat, just watched her, letting her stew in it. He'd walked in a stranger, but he'd leave a king. What would he do with her now? Kick her out like she'd done to him? Or give her a taste of something else? And how would she face a world where the man she'd laughed had held all the cards? The air in Morgan's corner store crackled with tension, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder than ever as Chris Baldwin stood behind the counter he'd just claimed as his own. At 58, he cut a different figure now. No more patch coat or hunched shoulders, just a thrift store suit and a steely calm that filled the room. The deed still sat on the counter, its ink glaring up at Linda Morgan like a guilty verdict, and a handful of customers, old lady with her cane, kid with his spilled soda, watched wide-eyed, caught in the drama unfolding. Linda, her face a mask of panic and defiance, gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "You can't do this," she spat, her voice trembling but sharp. "I've run this place for years. You're a nobody." Chris didn't flinch, his gray eyes locked on hers, steady as stone. "Nobody who owns it now," he said, tapping the deed with a finger scarred from years of hard knocks. "You had your shot yesterday. Kick me out, laugh me off. How's that working for you?" Linda's mouth twisted, her breath hitching as she scrambled for a lifeline. "Please," she said, her tone flipping fast from venom to desperation. I didn't know who you were. It's been crazy here. Pressure, long hours. I messed up, okay? Don't take my job. I need this." Her eyes darted to the gawking crowd, her pride crumbling under their stares, but Chris stayed quiet, letting her words hang like smoke. The teens by the shelves shifted, whispering, "She's begging now?" After all that, while the cashier edged toward the back, her hands fidgeting like she wanted out of the blast zone. The old lady leaned on her cane, her grin sharp, muttering, "Serves her right." Chris folded his arms, his silence louder than any shout, and watched Linda squirm. 5 years on the streets had taught him plenty. How people turn when the tables flip, how quick the high and mighty fall when the ground shifts. She'd ruled this store like a petty tyrant, kicking him out without a second thought. And now she was pleading, her kingdom slipping through her fingers. He didn't buy the sob story. Not yet. After a beat, he stepped around the counter, his boots scuffing the linoleum, and faced the room. "Everybody here?" he said, his voice carrying over the hum. "Good. Time we talk." The teens shuffled closer, the cashier peeked out, and the customers froze, sensing something big. Linda shrank back, her hands twisting in her apron, as Chris raised his voice. Not loud, just firm, like a man who'd earned the right to be heard. "Name's Chris Baldwin. Used to run a business, small one, nothing fancy. Lost it all when my wife died, ended up on the streets. Yesterday, this lady," he nodded at Linda, who flinched, "told me I didn't belong here. Guess she was wrong." A murmur rippled through the group, the kid nodding slow, the old lady clapping once, sharp and approving. Chris kept going, his tone rough but steady. "Got lucky. Friend left me enough to buy this place. Didn't do it to sit pretty, did to fix what's broken. This store," he swept a hand around, taking in the dusty shelves, the flickering lights. "It's going to serve everybody, rich, poor, don't matter. No more chasing folks out 'cause they don't fit your picture." He turned to Linda, his eyes narrowing. "That's not how I run things." Her face went slack, the fight draining out as his words sank in. "You're firing me," she said. Not a question, just a flat, hollow realization. Chris tilted his head, considering her, then nodded once. "Yeah, you're done here." A gasp shot through the room. The cashier's hand flew to her mouth. The teens froze mid-whisper. Linda stumbled back, her voice breaking. You can't. I've got nowhere else. Please, give me a chance. Chris held up a hand, cutting her off. You had chances every day you worked here. Blowing all. But I'm not you. I don't kick people when they're down. Find another job. Learn something from this. Doors open somewhere else, just not here. The room went quiet again, the weight of it settling over everyone. Linda's shoulders slumped, tears streaking her face, but she didn't argue, just stood there, a shadow of the woman who'd ruled this place yesterday. Chris turned back to the crew, his voice softening but firm. Rest of you, I'm keeping you on for now. We're cleaning this place up, starting fresh. No more yelling, no more crap. You're here to help people, not scare them off. Got it. The teens nodded fast. The cashier managed a shaky, yes, sir, and the customers broke into scattered claps, the old lady leading the charge. Linda grabbed her purse from behind the counter, her hands shaking as she shoved past the teens, the bell jangling hard as she bolted out. Chris watched her go, his chest tight, not with victory, but with the echo of every time he'd been the one shoved aside. He'd built this moment from nothing, turned her own game against her, but it wasn't over. The store was as now, a blank slate with a crew half stunned and half hopeful, and he had to make it work, not just for him, but for every soul who'd walked through that door. Could Linda claw her way back from this, or was she done for good? And what would this place look like when he was through with it? The morning sun streamed through the freshly scrubbed windows of Morgan's corner store, casting a warm glow over shelves that gleamed with new paint and order. Chris Baldwin stood by the door, his 58-year-old frame steady in a simple button-down, his beard trimmed neat, his gray eyes scanning the place he'd turn upside down in a matter of days. The old linoleum shone under a fresh wax. The flickering lights replaced with bright bulbs, and a handwritten sign hung above the register. Everyone welcome, always. It had been a week since he'd fired Linda Morgan, a week since he'd laid down the law to a stunned crew, and today was the grand reopening, a chance to prove this wasn't just talk, but a promise kept. The bell jingled as the first customers trickled in, not just the usuals, but faces Chris hadn't seen before. A guy in a threadbare coat shuffled toward the bread aisle, his hands shaky but his head up. A mom with 2 kids trailed behind, her cart rattling with cans and a loaf of day-old discounted just for her. The teens, now in crisp aprons, darted around, stocking shelves with a nervous energy, while the cashier, Jenny, flashed a shy smile at every thank you she got. Chris watched it all, his chest loosening with every nod, every quiet morning tossed his way. This was what he'd wanted, not just a store, but a place where nobody'd get the shove he'd felt too many times. Linda was gone, her shadow scrubbed out with the grime. Word around Fairview was she'd landed a gig at a gas station 2 towns over. Lower pay, less power, a fresh start she'd have to earn. Chris hadn't budged on her firing, but he'd meant what he said. He wasn't here to kick her when she was down. Let her figure it out, he'd told Jenny that first day, when she'd asked if Linda might come crawling back. She's got a chance somewhere, just not with me. He'd spent the week training the crew himself. How to ring up a sale without a sneer, how to spot a customer who needed a break more than a bill. Treat 'em like people, he'd said, over and over, till it stuck. The doors swung wide by noon, the store buzzing with more life than it had seen in years. The old lady with the cane, Edna, he'd learned, rolled in with a grin, her basket full of soup cans and a candy bar she'd never have dared ask Linda for. Looking sharp, Mr. Baldwin, she said, her voice crackling with approval. Chris tipped his head, a faint smile breaking through. Call me Chris, Edna, just keeping a promise. She cackled, tapping her cane. Promise worth keeping. Behind her, a guy in a stained jacket hesitated, then stepped up with a crumpled dollar for a coffee. Chris waved it off. On me today, he said, pouring it himself. The guy blinked, muttered a thanks, and shuffled out, clutching the cup like a lifeline. By closing, the register was full. Not a fortune, but steady, real. Chris locked up, the crew lingering to sweep and chat, their voices lighter than he'd ever heard. Jenny hung back, her apron balled in her hands. You really changed it, she said, soft but sure. Folks aren't scared to come in anymore. Chris nodded, his throat tight. That's the point. He lost everything once, wife, business, home, but this was pulling it back, piece by piece, not for him alone, but for every soul who'd been told they didn't belong. The streets had taught him what it felt like to be invisible. Now he'd made a place where nobody had to be. A month later, the store was a fixture. Lines out the door some days, a mix of suits and rags, kids and old-timers, all treated the same. Chris stood outside one evening, the sign glowing above him, a quiet pride settling in his bones. He'd walked in here a ghost, laughed out by Linda, and walked out an owner who'd rewritten the rules. Edna rolled by, tossing him a wave. "Best damn store in Fairview," she called. He chuckled, waving back, and thought of Linda, wherever she was, whatever she'd learned. He hadn't forgiven her, not quite, but he'd given her what she'd never given him, a shot to start over. "Don't judge a book by its cover," he might have said if he were here with you now. "You never know who's standing in front of you, or what they've got up their sleeve." If you were Chris, would you have let Linda stay? Tell us below, what's your call? Thanks for writing this one out. Hit like if it hit you, subscribe for more, and drop a comment. We're here for it.